As soon as Sauron set the One Ring upon his finger, they were aware of him, and they knew him, and perceived that he would be master of them, and of all that they wrought. Then in anger and fear they took off their rings. But he, finding that he was betrayed, and that the elves were not deceived, was filled with wrath, and he came against them in open war, demanding that all the rings should be delivered to him, since the elven smiths could not have attained to their making without his lore and counsel. But the elves fled from him, and 3 of their rings they saved, and bore them away, and hid them. Hey everyone, Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. It is really good to be back after taking last weekend off to heal and rest, and thank you all so much for your patience and kind words. They mean so much to me. Today I want to take a look at a war that I've often referenced, especially in my Second Age videos, and it's now long overdue that we take a look at the War of the Elves and Sauron during the mid-Second Age, during which Eregion was devastated. I'll link related videos and articles in the description and cards for more information. We'll first take a look at each side of the war and their commanders, before looking at the story and history of the war and its battles. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. The War of the Elves and Sauron took place from 1693 to 1701 of the Second Age, and was fought between 2 diametrically opposed forces, and in many ways, this war was a prelude of the struggles against Sauron at the end of the age during the War of the Last Alliance, as there were many of the same participating factions. On the side of the Free Peoples, we have elves of different lands. There were the Noldor of Eregion, led by Celebrimbor and Celeborn, and the Elves of Lindon, who were mostly mixed between the Noldor and Sindar, and they followed High King Gil-galad and his herald Elrond Half-Elven. There too were the Elves of Lorinand, later named Lothlorien, led by Prince Amroth. Concerning the number of participating elves in this war, it's safe to say they likely numbered in the tens or hundreds of thousands, with a majority of them coming from Eregion and Lindon. But these elves did not stand alone against the servant of Morgoth, returned out of the dark years through subtlety for vengeance. Durin's folk, the Longbeards of Khazad-dûm, later named Moria, stood with their elven friends, and they were led by Durin III. The dwarves must have numbered in the thousands or tens of thousands. It's possible there were even more, since Durin's folk of Khazad-dûm had not been in many, if any, wars up to this point in the timeline. But these forces of the Free Peoples would not have alone been enough to defeat Sauron at this time, and indeed, Númenorians came from out of the west and participated in the later part of the war, and they followed their commander, Kiriatur, under the orders of King Tar-Minestir. The Númenorians also must have numbered in the tens or hundreds of thousands, being a mighty host indeed, and the first great army of Númenor since the island's creation. This would be Sauron's true introduction to the strength of the Númenorians, and the threat to his dominion that they posed. Now, on the other side, there is not as much to say. At this time, the Nazgûl had not yet appeared in Middle-earth as the servants of Sauron, and indeed, Sauron had not yet given them the 9 rings, as he received those rings in this war. So, it was truly the orcs, trolls, and other servants that came out of Mordor, led by Sauron himself, that made up his forces throughout the war. They must have numbered in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. With all of that said, let's get into depth concerning the history of the war itself. After the creation of the One Ring around the year 1600 of the Second Age, and the open proclamation of Sauron as he put on his ring, the elves who received the 3 elven rings knew that they had been deceived, and so they took off their rings and hid them. Sauron, however, also realizing that something had happened without his knowledge, and Celebrimbor and his smiths had created 3 elven rings that had not been tainted by Sauron, was wrathful. And so the Dark Lord demanded the surrender of those rings. But the elves would of course not do this, and each ring would eventually go to 3 of the most powerful elves of that time, for they were to be their guardians: Gil-galad, Círdan the Shipwright, and the Lady Galadriel. There is confusion whether the ring Narya came to Círdan during the war, or a long time after the war, and after it was in Gil-galad's possession, but eventually Círdan would receive it in the end. Either way, 2 of the 3 elven rings found their way to Lindon, while the other went to Lorinand. And so for almost 100 years, Sauron prepared his forces for the war. In 1693 of the Second Age, the elven rings were hidden, and the war began. In 1695, Sauron's forces invaded Eriador, coming north through Calanarthon, and eventually coming into Eregion. In that same year, High King Gil-galad heard the news and sent Elrond with many of his forces into Eregion to aid Celebrimbor. The High King also sent word to Númenor that year for aid. Elrond, however, had quite a distance to cover with such an army, and Sauron's forces made straight for Eregion. Celeborn led a sortie against Sauron's vanguard, and he was able to join his force with that of Elrond's, but the host of Mordor was far too great to be overcome. Thus Sauron's forces came into the house of Myrdain, where the smithies and treasuries were. Celebrimbor himself stood against Sauron on the steps of the great door of the Myrdain, but he was taken prisoner, and the house was ransacked, just as Eregion itself was sacked. Sauron then took the 9 rings that would go to men, as well as other lesser works. Celebrimbor was tormented, and thus Sauron would learn the location of the 7 rings that would go to the dwarves. Now, if this telling of the tale is true, then the story that the dwarves of Durin's folk told that claimed Celebrimbor himself gave King Durin III his ring before the sacking of Eregion would be false, as Sauron would have given them their ring in the end. At the least, this is a contested point in the lore, whether Sauron took all of the dwarven rings here and distributed them, or if Durin already had his ring given to him by Celebrimbor. Anyway, Celebrimbor valued the 3 elven rings more than the others, and Sauron could learn nothing about them from Celebrimbor, and thus the elf was put to death, his body filled with orc arrows and hung upon a pole as a banner of the evils of Sauron. Sauron had guessed where went the elvish rings, as they must have gone to powerful elven guardians indeed. And Sauron thus returned to war, turning against Elrond's forces, whose army had swelled only a bit with others such as Celeborn and his followers joining him. These elves had not forces enough to withstand Sauron, so they fled back north into the Trollshaws, and would come to a hidden valley and refuge that the elves thusly named Imladris, the deep dale of the cleft, and so Rivendell was founded in 1697. But Elrond and his forces could never have even made the retreat had the dwarves of Khazad-dûm sent by Durin III, and the elves of Lorenond led by Amroth, not come forth from Khazad-dûm and the doors of Durin to assail the rearguard of Sauron's forces, thus splitting the Dark Lord's attention. They were driven back into Khazad-dûm in 1697, and the doors of Durin were sealed shut, and Sauron could not enter there. But he commanded all orcs to harry dwarves where they may, as they had earned the wrath and hatred of the Dark Lord. And so Sauron attempted to gain the control and mastery of all of Eriador, leaving Lorenond for later, and he ravaged the lands and slaughtered the men and elves he could find. His most immediate plan was to take Lindon and seize 1 or more of the elven rings, but he had to detach a part of his force to the north for the siege of Imladris, as he did not want Elrond's forces to attack him from the rear as he made his way to Lindon. And so Sauron's forces had overrun most of Eriador, and things looked grim for Gil-galad's army, as Sauron had even come to the river Lune on the east side of Lindon, when out of the west came a great armament, a navy of King Tar-Minastir from Númenor. At this time, Númenor was still faithful to their friends, the elves. And although it had taken 5 years since Gil-galad had sent his message, the Númenorians came into Middle-earth in 1700 with a massive army. They joined with the Númenorians who were already in Middle-earth fighting alongside Gil-galad. Even though Sauron had summoned more troops, he was utterly overmatched. He was driven away by the west at the slaughter of Sarn Ford, and even though Sauron had a great many forces, and some even at Tharbad, Commander Kirjatur of Númenor had also put a strong force of Númenorians at the mouth of the Gwathlo, or Greyflood, at the harbor of Vinyalande of Tar Aldarion, later called Lond Dire. And so ensued the Battle of the Gwathlo, where Sauron was caught between the hammer and the anvil of the Númenorians and elves to the north, and Númenorians to the south, and thus he was routed utterly and heavily defeated in 1701 of the Second Age. The Dark Lord only narrowly managed to escape, and he was again assaulted in the east of Calanarthon, likely by Númenorians, and with only a bodyguard he fled to Dagorlund. After his humiliating defeat, he returned to Mordor and vowed vengeance upon Númenor in retribution for all of this. And so the war of the elves and Sauron was at an end, but the outcomes and legacies of this war would live on for quite a long time. Some elves fled Middle-earth due to this war, making the number of that fair folk lesser in this world. In 1701, the First White Council would meet, and it was decided that Imladris would be the new elvish stronghold of eastern Eriador, for Eregion was in ruins and would never be repaired. It would be during this great meeting in Imladris that Elrond was given the ring Vilja from Gil-galad, and he was made Gil-galad's vice-regent. Elrond would also meet Celebrian, daughter of Galadriel and Celeborn, for Galadriel and Celebrian would eventually make their way to Imladris to reunite with Celeborn. The Númenorians, having found a taste for power in Middle-earth, would establish stronger, permanent strongholds in western Middle-earth, preventing Sauron from moving out of Mordor for a long time. However, Sauron would still manage to give 9 rings to men, and 7 rings to dwarves. And so with Sauron defeated, and more reluctant to leave Barad-dûr during wartime afterwards, we come to the end of our tale about the War of the Elves and Sauron. From this tale of war, we see a common theme of Tolkien's works. To truly stand against the shadow, and to ensure peace, we must also ensure strong friendships and alliances with each other, and only then can we hope for victory. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts, questions, additions, and corrections about the War of the Elves and Sauron? Let me know in the comments below. This is a truly fascinating war in Tolkien's Legendarium, and there was even much more to it than I had originally thought, which I learned while making this video. To further support the channel, please check out our music channel, Facebook, Twitter, merch, and consider donating to our Patreon for our podcasts and Discord server. Links are in the description below. Last Thursday, some of my patrons and I played another game of Battle for Middle-earth, and it's always such a fun time, so if that sounds like something you'd like to participate in, please consider joining our Patreon. We will also have an upcoming podcast this week. We tend to play and have our podcasts come out about once a month. I also want to shout out our Valor tier patrons: Adrian De La Tour, Chris Ortner, Peter Shepard, Lane Grimes, Samuel McBee, Jonathan Putnam, Mark Kralik, and Blair Scouten. Thank you guys so much. The support means a lot to me. Finally, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today, and I will see you all again next week with a video on the history of Minas Morgul in the spirit of Halloween. Everyone, as always, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one, my great friends.